January 1946. A winter wind moves across the broken streets of Bremerhaven, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the quiet murmur of a defeated nation trying to stand again. The war is over, yet its weight still clings to every wall, every face, every silent corner of the port. Along the docks, U.S. Navy transport ships prepare for another day of post-war duty, moving supplies, carrying personnel, and returning groups of German POWs to processing stations. Steam coils upward from the vessels, mixing with the icy air. American sailors tighten the straps on their duffel bags, stamping their boots against the cold metal planks. Among the crowd of displaced Germans waiting for instructions stands a young woman, thin from rationing, coat threadbare, hands clasped tightly around a small bundle of belongings. She is quiet, composed, and uncertain of what comes next. Like thousands of others, she has been classified in the long bureaucratic aftermath of war. Another number in a column. Another civilian swept into the machinery of occupation. A U.S. Navy sailor stepping onto the pier notices her not through romance or fate, but through simple human recognition of someone trying to survive. And the world around them is about to shift into the long story that follows. In the final months of World War II, Germany collapsed not in a single moment, but in waves, front by front, city by city, institution by institution. By April 1945, the Nazi government was disintegrating, the Wehrmacht was surrendering in fragments, and millions of civilians were left without direction, protection, or even basic structure. Roads filled with refugees. Farms stood abandoned. Cities burned. The Reich that once shouted of permanence had dissolved into scattered groups of people trying to survive. Another day, the Allied forces moved deeper into German territory with an administrative load almost as heavy as their military one. Victory did not mean rest. It meant responsibility. The U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, and Allied administrations had to process million soldiers, prisoners, former forced laborers, foreign workers, and civilians. Among them were women who had been attached to military units as auxiliaries, clerks, communication staff, or in labor roles. Some were formally classified as POWs in the chaos of surrender. Others were simply detained during mass processing to ensure no military personnel slipped through unnoticed. Germany itself no longer functioned as a nation. The Allied Control Council divided the country into occupation zones. American forces oversaw the southwest and parts of the north, including critical ports like Bremerhaven. These ports became lifelines, hubs where ships arrived with supplies and departed with personnel. For American naval units, the war's end did not mean going home immediately. Instead, they shifted into new duties, transporting displaced persons, escorting repatriation groups, and maintaining the logistical arteries of the new occupation structure. The U.S. Navy found itself playing an unusual role on German soil. Sailors accustomed to combat duty were now dock workers, transport overseers, and security assistants. They handled everything from medical shipments to POW transfers. The war had ended, but operational tempo remained high. Each day brought lists, columns of names, classifications, destinations. Prisoners who needed processing. Civilians who needed relocation. Workers who needed documentation. Every decision required oversight. The German civilian population, particularly women, bore the heaviest burden of the collapse. With approximately 7 million German soldiers dead, wounded, or captured, women were left to carry the remnants of daily life. Many worked in clearing rubble, assisting Allied administrators, or trying desperately to reclaim lost homes. Food was scarce. Infrastructure was destroyed. Rations were minimal. Winter was merciless. Relief organizations warned repeatedly that starvation, disease, and exposure could claim more lives in peace than the fighting had in the war's final year. The classification of certain women as POWs reflected circumstances rather than ideology. Those who had served in military-adjacent roles or were present during mass surrenders were often detained temporarily. International law required processing, identity verification, and security screening. Many were released quickly, but others remained in holding facilities to await proper documentation or transfer. No two cases were identical, but the bureaucratic machinery treated all names as identical entries in long, impersonal ledgers. Yet despite the scale of the crisis, American units, unlike some occupying forces, generally aim to operate within legal and humanitarian boundaries. Reports from the U.S. occupation authorities show that American-run processing centers maintain stricter standards of food distribution, medical care, and discipline compared to other zones. This did not remove hardship, but it shaped the environment in which German civilians and American servicemen interacted. By late 1945 and early 1946, scenes like Bremerhaven had become routine. Rows of German detainees awaiting instruction, American sailors supervising transports, relief workers distributing limited supplies. There was no storytelling flourish in it, just the daily rhythm of rebuilding a continent shattered by years of conflict. And in that rhythm, tens of thousands of small human intersections occurred. A soldier handing out blankets, a German family asking for directions, a clerk translating documents, a sailor assisting a displaced person with boarding. None were extraordinary on their own. They were the quiet, unnoticed moments of post-war administration. It was within this atmosphere, cold, exhausted, burdened by survival, that a German woman classified among the processed civilians stood near a transport zone. And it was here that a U.S. Navy sailor, performing routine duties on a routine day, noticed her standing alone in the winter light, a moment that would lead into a far larger story. The processing of German POWs and detainees in the American zone followed a structured, but often overwhelming system. In theory, every individual was to be identified, documented, medically examined, and categorized. In practice, the administrative weight was massive. Millions had to be screened, some for war crimes, others simply to confirm they had no military affiliation. Women who had worked in signal units, clerical offices, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, or field support roles were frequently detained until their status could be confirmed. Each case required paperwork, witnesses, and verification through multiple Allied databases. Facilities varied in size and purpose. Some were temporary holding areas made from repurposed barracks or warehouses. Others were larger transit camps designed to funnel detainees through medical inspections and administrative interviews. Conditions were harsh but typically followed U.S. military standards, regulated meals, supervised movement, and documented routines. Overcrowding was common. Supplies were rationed carefully. Winter cold made the situation even more difficult, especially in northern Germany, where coal shortages left entire towns without proper heating. For women classified as POWs or detainees, daily life was a mixture of uncertainty and monotony. Wake-up calls before dawn, bread and ersatz coffee for breakfast, long lines for medical checks or administrative questioning. Work assignments cleaning, organizing, or assisting with camp logistics varied depending on location and the individual's background. Most detainees hoped for release, but the speed of processing depended on available personnel, transportation schedules, and priority lists that shifted weekly. The presence of American forces brought a different atmosphere compared to other occupation zones. Reports from the period indicate that U.S. personnel were instructed to maintain disciplined, lawful conduct. Fraternization rules were initially strict, prohibiting unnecessary interactions with German civilians. These restrictions eased slowly as 1945 turned into 1946, reflecting the reality that cooperation was essential for reconstruction. Yet the culture remained cautious. Every interaction between American servicemen and German civilians carried the weight of war, policy, and lingering distrust. Still, human contact was unavoidable. Sailors guarding supply depots exchanged brief words with workers clearing debris. Military police directed civilians through processing lines. Nurses treated malnourished detainees regardless of nationality. Small gestures offering water, providing directions, helping someone board a vehicle occurred quietly amid the machinery of post-war administration. Bremerhaven, in particular, was a crossroads. The port served as one of the main exit points for American personnel returning home and one of the main entry points for supplies feeding the occupation infrastructure. Naval transport ships arrived and departed frequently. Each departure required coordination between Army units, Navy crews, and occupation administrators. It was here that groups of detainees were sometimes moved between facilities or prepared for transfer to other locations. German women, especially those approaching release or reassignment, often passed through these ports for brief periods. Some awaited transportation. Others awaited documents confirming their discharge. The environment was tense but orderly, a mix of military precision and civilian desperation. For the Americans stationed there, the post-war months brought a strange mixture of duty and introspection. Many had survived battles across the Atlantic or Pacific. Others had lost friends or endured long deployments. They were young men, often barely in their 20s, suddenly responsible for helping stabilize a former enemy nation. In the cold light of Germany's destroyed cities, the lines between duty and empathy blurred. They saw hunger up close. They saw children without winter coats. They saw families searching ruins for remnants of their homes. War had ended, but its impact surrounded them daily. The story of a German woman standing among processed detainees and a U.S. sailor performing his assigned tasks cannot be separated from this broader environment. Neither acted outside the circumstances they were placed in. He was part of an occupying force still bound by military rules. She was one of thousands trying to navigate a future built from the ruins of a defeated homeland. Yet real history is shaped as much by individual lives as by grand strategies. Ordinary people, caught in extraordinary times, make choices that ripple far beyond their expected paths. And in the cold months of early 1946, amid the docks, ships, and paperwork of Bremerhaven, their paths were about to cross in a way that neither could have predicted. Angle 1. The human condition after collapse. In the months following Germany's surrender, survival became a daily calculation rather than an assumption. Food was scarce, heat unreliable, and certainty non-existent. German civilians, especially women, found themselves navigating a world stripped of structure. Families were separated. Homes were destroyed. Entire cities had become skeletal frames of stone and ash. In this environment, dignity was fragile, often reduced to the simple effort of standing in line for rations or clutching a small bundle of belongings as identity proof. For many women, the end of the war did not bring safety. Instead, they faced hunger, displacement, and the constant fear of further loss. Those detained for processing lived in a limbo between past and future, unsure whether release meant returning to nothing or starting again somewhere unfamiliar. The human mind, exhausted by years of propaganda, bombing, and scarcity, shifted into survival mode. This was the emotional landscape in which the German woman at the center of this story lived. She was neither an officer nor a figure of political significance. She was one among millions, shaped by the war, altered by defeat, and burdened by the simple question of what tomorrow held. Her presence at the port that winter was not extraordinary. It was tragically normal. And yet, within this ordinary struggle, the seeds of an unexpected human connection were quietly forming. These were the realities that defined her world, and they would shape the meaning of the moment when an American sailor paused long enough to truly see her. Angle 2. The American sailor's post-war duty. For U.S. Navy sailors stationed in Europe after the war, the mission had shifted dramatically. No longer focused on convoy escorts, amphibious operations, or Atlantic patrols, they now found themselves responsible for maintaining order, moving personnel, and supporting the massive Allied occupation effort. It was a quiet but demanding form of service, one built not on gunfire, but on logistics, paperwork, and discipline. Many sailors were young, often barely out of high school before war pulled them across the ocean. Months or years away from home left them carrying both pride and exhaustion. As victories were declared and ships flew homebound flags, those who remained in Europe operated in a different emotional space. They watched a former enemy struggle through hunger and ruin. They witnessed civilians digging through rubble for anything salvageable. They guarded supply lines that fed not soldiers, but starving families. For the sailor in this story, duty meant adherence to rules, maintain watch, supervise transfers, assist with transport operations, and avoid unnecessary personal involvement with civilians. Fraternization restrictions lingered, though gradually easing. He was tasked with order, not sentiment. Yet standing on the docks of Bremerhaven, he was also human, capable of empathy, shaped by months of seeing devastation up close. When he noticed the young woman in the long line of detainees, it was not an act of defiance or romance. It was the brief, quiet realization that the war's outcome had left ordinary people his age, his generation, struggling simply to exist. And in that recognition, An invisible thread of humanity formed, one that would be tested by rules, distance, and the complexities of a war not long past. Angle 3. The moral and social line between former enemies. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the shift from warfare to occupation brought immediate ethical challenges. The Allies were now responsible for stabilizing a nation they had fought fiercely for years. Morally, it was an uneasy position. The ink on surrender documents was barely dry, and the memories of conflict, submarines sinking Liberty ships, bombings, casualties were still painfully fresh for American servicemen. To prevent misunderstandings, protect discipline, and maintain order, the U.S. military enforced strict regulations governing interactions with Germans. Fraternization was initially prohibited. Relationships, even simple friendships, were discouraged. The rationale was clear. Emotional entanglements blurred boundaries, weakened authority, and risked compromising military judgment. It was only gradually, through official policy reviews, that these rules softened. By late 1945, limited social contact became permissible. By 1946, marriage permissions were possible but heavily monitored. For German civilians, especially women, the social dynamics were even more complex. Their country had been the aggressor. Their lives were now overseen by young men in foreign uniforms. Trust was scarce. Resentment lingered. Survival overshadowed everything else. This backdrop made any connection between a German woman and an American sailor delicate, fraught with unspoken tensions, shaped by policies and weighed down by history. Nothing about such an interaction was simple. Every word exchanged risked scrutiny. Every gesture carried implication. Yet history shows that in the ruins of war, human beings often sought understanding in places where rules advised caution. And it was within this complicated moral landscape that their paths would intersect in a way that neither regulation nor circumstance could fully prevent. Angle 4. Gender, vulnerability, and survival in post-war Germany. In the aftermath of the war, German women bore responsibilities and risks far beyond their years. Many had lost husbands, brothers, or fathers on the Eastern Front. Others had been evacuated from their homes, displaced by bombings, or forced into labor roles as the Reich collapsed. When the shooting stopped, they were left standing amid ruins with little protection, few resources, and no guarantees. Historically, the chaos of 1945-46 exposed women to high degrees of vulnerability. They waited hours in ration lines, scavenged through debris for firewood, and attempted to rebuild households with no supplies. Female detainees classified for processing faced even greater uncertainty. Their fate depended on administrative decisions far removed from their personal circumstances. Some were held for weeks or months before receiving release orders. Every day felt like a negotiation with hunger, cold, and bureaucracy. This environment made small gestures, food shared, guidance offered, kindness shown more than mere courtesies. They were lifelines. A conversation with a guard or transport officer might determine where a detainee slept or when she could see a doctor. A moment of understanding could change the direction of an entire week. For the woman at the center of this story, vulnerability was not her identity, but her circumstance. She had survived the war, submitted to Allied processing, and now waited for the next chapter, uncertain whether it would bring stability or more loss. The presence of an American sailor, steady and disciplined amid the ruins, represented more than authority. It represented structure in a world where structure had collapsed. And in that fragile balance, the seeds of trust found their place. Angle 5. U.S. military policies on fraternization and marriage. The U.S. military entered post-war Germany with clear rules: no unnecessary contact with German civilians. These fraternization bans aimed to preserve discipline, prevent misunderstandings, and maintain moral distance from a recently defeated enemy. Soldiers caught violating the rules risked reprimand or reassignment. The policy was strict, though not absolute, revised repeatedly as occupation realities shifted. By mid-1945, the sheer scale of humanitarian need forced adjustments. American forces were providing food, medical care, and administrative oversight to millions. Complete separation became impractical. In September 1945, the U.S. eased fraternization restrictions, allowing casual social interactions. But romantic relationships remained heavily discouraged, monitored, and bureaucratically burdened. Marriage required a long list of approvals, commanding officers, military chaplains, legal authorities, and security screenings. The bride had to undergo background checks to confirm she held no political affiliation with banned organizations. The groom had to demonstrate stability and good standing. The process could take months. Only in 1946 did U.S. authorities begin approving German-American marriages in significant numbers. These policies shaped the context in which a sailor and a German woman might learn to trust each other. Any bond formed between them faced hurdles, legal, social, and institutional. It required restraint, patience, and a willingness to navigate layers of paperwork most servicemen had never imagined dealing with. This was the environment in which their story unfolded, a world where affection was not forbidden, but closely observed, where a simple conversation could lead to consequences, and where any commitment had to withstand the slow machinery of military regulation. Angle 6. Cultural contrast. Between ruined Germany and post-war America, few contrasts in the mid-20th century were as stark as the one between Germany in 1946 and the United States returning to peacetime prosperity. While German cities lay in rubble, American cities glowed with neon signs, full shelves, and returning soldiers welcomed as heroes. For German civilians, especially those who left Europe after the war, the cultural difference was overwhelming. Germany was ration books, cold apartments, bombed-out streets, and a currency so unstable that cigarettes became a form of payment. America was motorcars, supermarkets, paved roads, and futures imagined with optimism rather than fear. For many German women who later emigrated, the emotional shift was as dramatic as the physical one. They moved from scarcity to abundance, from shattered infrastructure to functioning communities. American servicemen saw the contrast as well. They lived under military discipline, but their uniforms carried privileges: reliable food, warm clothing, stable housing. In the eyes of many Germans, American soldiers represented a distant world, one where life continued without interruption. For the German woman and the U.S. sailor in this story, that contrast formed a silent backdrop to their early interactions. He came from a country where life was resuming. She came from one struggling to survive its past. Their conversations, brief at first, took place across this divide. Not as savior and rescued, but as two young people standing at opposite edges of history, meeting in the narrow space where their worlds briefly overlapped. And it was in that narrow space that the turning point of their story began to form. The cold morning at the Bremerhaven docks began like hundreds before it. The lines of detainees moved slowly, guided by military police and administrative staff toward designated checkpoints. Most carried small bundles, documents, clothing, or the last remnants of a former life. The U.S. Navy transport ship anchored nearby released steady plumes of steam as its engines warmed, preparing for another cycle of transfers. The air was thick with the mixture of diesel, sea salt, and the muted murmur of hundreds of people awaiting orders. The sailor assigned to the pier that day followed his usual routine: inspect boarding ramps, verify cargo manifests, assist Army personnel coordinating detainee movement, and ensure no one approached unauthorized zones. The tasks were repetitive but essential. Every name on the list had to match a document. Every movement had to follow protocol. Order kept chaos at bay. It was during an intake pause, one of those brief moments when the line slowed and a silence settled over the pier, that he noticed her again. The young woman he had seen before, standing among the others with her bundle clutched tightly to her chest. Her posture was controlled, her expression alert but reserved. She was not pushing for attention, not speaking out of turn, not breaking any rule. She was simply waiting, like everyone else, for the next instruction. What drew his attention was not drama, but composure. Many detainees were anxious. Some cried quietly. Others argued with officers, begging for clarification about their status. But she remained still, responding when spoken to, stepping forward only when ordered. There was a steadiness in her demeanor that seemed out of place amid the tension surrounding her. He stepped closer, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. A group of detainees had been misdirected earlier, and he needed to verify which section of the line she belonged to. When he addressed her, she answered in the formal, careful tone many Germans used with American personnel. Her voice carried the fatigue of someone who had stood in lines for too many months, yet she spoke clearly enough to explain her situation. She had completed medical screening and identity verification. She awaited final processing before being moved to another holding area. Interaction was brief, professional, entirely within the rules. But as he checked the paperwork in her hand, the sailor noticed its condition, creased from repeated handling, edges worn from cold fingers gripping it every day. It was the kind of document that had been asked for at every checkpoint, every interview, every gate. A small symbol of how long she had been in transit. He returned the papers and directed her to the correct position. She nodded and stepped forward without complaint. Usually, that would have been the end of it. But a minor delay halted the processing line again, an error in the transport list. While officers resolved the discrepancy, the detainees stood waiting. The sailor remained at his post, and in the pause, he became aware of how young many of them were. People his age, some younger. People who had lived through different sides of the same war. He saw her glance toward the harbor, just once at the departing ships with American flags. It was not longing, not fear, not hope. It was simply a look at a world so distant from her own, that it might as well have been another century. When the line resumed, she stepped forward again. This time, a gust of wind swept across the dock, pushing at the documents in her hand. She fumbled slightly, catching them before they slipped away. It was a small moment, nothing extraordinary, but the sailor reacted by instinct, steadying the papers with a gloved hand. Their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. Military rules discouraged unnecessary conversation. Yet something passed between them in that split second, something subtle, grounded not in emotion but in recognition. Two young people, shaped by war, standing on opposite sides of its outcome. From that moment onward, he found himself taking note of her position in the line. Not intrusively, not irregularly, just enough to ensure she reached the correct checkpoints without being lost in the shifting crowd. Each station she passed brought her closer to a transfer stage he would help oversee. When the time came for her group to move toward the transport zone, he assisted with organizing the detainees into smaller units. His instructions were clear, firm, procedural. Hers was the last group to step forward before boarding. She held her bundle close, following the group without hesitation. As she reached the ramp, her documents slipped again, caught this time not by the wind, but by the push of the crowd behind her. The sailor moved quickly, retrieving them before they slid into the gap between ramp and dock. She turned, met his eyes once more, and offered a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. Gratitude expressed within the limits of regulation and circumstance. He returned the papers, maintaining the professional distance required. But the moment lingered longer than he expected, not because of sentiment, not because of rule-breaking, but because, after months of witnessing hardship from afar, he had finally seen a single individual within the masses, someone whose composure hinted at a story the war had not erased. And as her group prepared to board the transport, the decision that would alter the direction of both their futures quietly began to take shape. The boarding ramp creaked under the weight of the detainees as they stepped onto the ship, their breath rising in faint clouds beneath the gray winter sky. The sailor remained at his post near the foot of the gangway, checking each name against the manifest. His gloved hand traced each line methodically, matching identities with their designated compartments below deck. It was routine, mechanical, necessary, and detached. But when her turn arrived, something shifted. Not in the procedure, not in the protocol, those remained unchanged. It was in the awareness of the moment. She handed him her documents once more, the pages flattened carefully as though she had spent the last few minutes preparing them. He examined them, confirming her classification, her processing stage, and her assigned destination, a transit camp further inland where final release forms would be issued. Nothing about her paperwork was unusual, yet he noticed the line indicating her prolonged wait in temporary facilities, longer than most. When he returned the documents, she hesitated, just briefly, as though wanting to speak but uncertain of the boundary between necessity and impropriety. In the end, she spoke only a simple phrase, quiet, formal German, acknowledging his assistance. It was not a conversation. It was not a personal exchange. But it carried the weight of someone who had not been met with kindness in a long time. The ship's horn signaled final boarding. The sailor stepped back, returning to the official distance he was expected to maintain. Her group moved up the ramp and disappeared into the dim light below deck. For most sailors, that would have been the last time they saw anyone from a detainee transport. Ships departed, new groups arrived, and the cycle repeated. But fate, or rather, The slow machinery of post-war bureaucracy shifted the pattern. A clerical error emerged. The manifest listed her group, but not the corresponding clearance sheet confirming completion of medical documentation. Without it, the ship could not depart. The army officer in charge halted movement and signaled for re-verification. The sailor, tasked with cross-checking, was sent aboard to locate the detainee group and verify their papers. He found them gathered quietly in a lower compartment, seated on benches bolted to the floor. The air inside was warmer, heavy with the scent of wet coats and worn wool. When he reached the woman's row, she looked up, surprised but not alarmed. He asked for her documents again, his tone professional, his posture disciplined. She complied immediately. As he examined her papers for discrepancies, he noticed a detail he had overlooked earlier, an annotation indicating she had been separated from her family during the collapse of her hometown. It was a small note, written in a clerk's hurried handwriting, but it explained the quiet strength she carried. She had endured not just processing, but loss layered upon loss. He returned the documents and moved through the rest of the group. When he completed his checks, he relayed the corrected information to the officer. The delay ended, the manifest balanced, and departure preparations resumed. But something had changed in the sailor subtly, silently. He no longer saw her as simply a detainee. He saw her as a person shaped by the same war that had shaped him. Though from opposite sides, the ship's engines rumbled to life again. As the detainees resettled, the sailor moved to the deck for departure oversight. Regulations kept him distant, yet as he looked across the crowd one last time, he saw her step near the railing, watching the harbor with a gaze that mixed apprehension and resignation. If the story had ended there, it would have been a moment of quiet humanity, nothing more. But the real turning point arrived weeks later, when the sailor's unit received temporary reassignment to the same inland region where her processing camp was located. Their duties aligned once more, not through personal effort, but through the unpredictability of post-war logistics. He arrived at the camp overseeing supply transfers and movement coordination. She, meanwhile, had transitioned to a civilian work detail, a common arrangement for detainees nearing release. Their paths crossed again, not by intention, but in a courtyard where work groups were organized for daily tasks. She recognized him first, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. He returned it with the restrained politeness military decorum required. This second meeting carried a different weight. Not the surprise of chance, but the quiet reaffirmation of recognition. They exchanged only necessary words, brief, controlled, appropriate. Yet each interaction chipped away at the invisible wall built by uniforms, rules, and the memory of conflict. Over the following days, their paths intersected in subtle ways. Not in secret, not in defiance, simply in the unavoidable overlap of duties and assignments. She began assisting with clerical tasks due to her literacy and organizational skills. He supervised movement logs. Occasionally their work overlapped, her sorting documents, him verifying totals. Their conversations remained formal, practical, and brief. But within those moments, something undeniably human took shape: trust. The turning point was not a single dramatic act. It was the slow, steady realization that in the aftermath of destruction, two people who should have remained strangers were beginning to understand one another, and soon. Circumstances would force a choice neither of them had expected to face. When her final release papers were issued, the war had already been over for nearly a year. The document she received was thin, just a few pages acknowledging that her detainment was complete, that she was cleared of military affiliation, and that she was free to rebuild her life somewhere within the ruins of her country. But freedom in post-war Germany was not a destination. It was an uncertainty. Cities were still fractured landscapes. Factories lay silent. Rationing remained severe. Many returning detainees found themselves without homes, without work, and without family to turn to. She was no different. The camp's administrators, aware of her clerical skills, offered her temporary work, assisting with civilian paperwork. It was not unusual many women in similar conditions were given office roles in occupation infrastructure. She accepted, grateful for the structure it provided. Yet she understood that the position was temporary. Just like the barracks she slept in and the thin meals she collected from the workers' kitchen, the sailors' unit, still tasked with supporting the region, crossed paths with her repeatedly. Their interactions remained respectful, bounded by the unspoken rules of post-war conduct. But in the rhythm of those days between supply checks, document handoffs, and the simple courtesy of shared responsibility, an unmistakable connection grew. Something steady, careful, and grounded not in romance, but in recognition of another human being emerging from the same shadowed world. American servicemen were not blind to the hardships around them. Reports from the occupation noted that many soldiers struggled emotionally with the contrast between their own relative stability and the deprivation faced by civilians. Some donated parts of their rations. Others volunteered in reconstruction efforts. The sailor found himself looking for small, permissible ways to ease her burdens, carrying extra supplies to the office where she worked, ensuring her paperwork piles didn't exceed what one person could manage, offering brief but sincere thanks for her efforts. These were not grand gestures. They were practical acts within the rules. Yet for her, they were reminders of something she had not felt in years. Safety. As weeks passed, the camp began preparing for downsizing. Thousands of detainees had been processed, and many facilities were being consolidated. Rumors circulated that some workers might be reassigned. Others might be released entirely. With each passing day, the uncertainty grew heavier. One afternoon, after a supply offload operation, the sailor encountered her outside the administrative hut, sitting on a small wooden crate. She held her release papers again, reading them with the kind of quiet tension that comes from realizing a chapter is closing without a clear next step. When she looked up, their eyes met not with expectation, but with honesty. It was then, in that unadorned moment, that the sailor understood the reality she faced. Release did not mean home. It meant starting again in a country that barely functioned. It meant surviving alone in cities where roofless buildings and hunger dominated daily life. For German women, the post-war years were particularly harsh. Many struggled against social stigma, displacement, and the trauma of war's end. Some married early out of necessity. Others emigrated through sponsored programs. A few formed relationships with allied servicemen, navigating a labyrinth of regulations to build new lives abroad. The sailor did not act impulsively. Each step he took was deliberate, measured against the rules of the military and the expectations of the occupation command. But over time, his sense of duty intertwined with a quieter conviction that if two people could help each other rise from the wreckage of war, it was not a betrayal of policy, but an affirmation of humanity. When he asked carefully, respectfully, whether she had family to return to, her answer was simple: no. That single word carried the weight of an entire war, and it set the stage for the next decision. He would make one that would require paperwork, approvals, and patience far beyond anything he had faced in uniform. The process of bringing a German civilian or former detainee to the United States after the war was not simple. It required layers of authorization, security checks, and formal interviews. The U.S. military, still cautious after years of conflict, scrutinized every application for marriage or transport involving German nationals. These were not obstacles designed to prevent human connection. They were safeguards built into a world that had only recently stopped fighting. When the sailor approached his commanding officer with an inquiry about the legal process for sponsorship and eventual marriage approval, he did so without dramatics. He followed protocol, submitted the required forms, and waited for the extensive background checks that would inevitably follow. She too underwent interviews, long sessions confirming her identity, her wartime affiliations, and her eligibility under Allied occupation law. The screenings were thorough, sometimes intrusive, always formal. But history shows that by 1946, American authorities were processing thousands of such cases. The image of the war bride was already emerging: women from Europe who married U.S. servicemen and rebuilt their futures across the Atlantic. Most were British or Italian, but hundreds were German women whose lives had been reshaped by the collapse of their nation and the unexpected arrival of American forces. For her, the process was equally overwhelming. She filled out forms she barely understood, spoke with officers who evaluated her answers with clinical precision, and waited through long weeks of uncertainty. Yet for the first time since the war's end, she felt the possibility of a path that did not lead back to ruins. Life at the camp shifted as her paperwork moved through channels. She continued her duties, sorting documents, assisting clerks, helping organize the shrinking administrative workload, but every day carried a new sense of direction. The sailor visited only when necessary for official tasks. They maintained decorum, mindful of the scrutiny such cases attracted. But their exchanges grew steadier, grounded in mutual respect and the understanding that what they were pursuing required patience rather than impulse. Approval did not come quickly. It came through a series of letters, stamps, and notations, each one moving her closer to eligibility for immigration under the War Brides Act and its related provisions. When final authorization arrived months later, it listed her name not as a detainee, but as a civilian cleared for departure on a U.S.-approved transport. Got the journey across the Guangzhou Atlantic was not glamorous. Post-war naval vessels carried returning servicemen, supplies, and authorized civilian passengers. She boarded with a small suitcase, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through displacement and detention. As the ship pulled away from Bremerhaven, she watched the shoreline fade, aware that she was leaving behind not just a country, but the shattered fragments of a life that war had taken from her. America, when she arrived, was a shock of color and noise. Streets unscarred by bombing, houses with intact roofs, markets with shelves full of goods she had not seen in years. For many German women arriving during this period, the adjustment was both hopeful and disorienting. They entered communities still raw from wartime losses, where some welcomed them with warmth, while others viewed them through the lens of recent history. Integration took time measured not in days, but in years. For the sailor, the return home carried its own weight. Veterans were rebuilding their futures, seeking work, resuming studies, or helping relatives who had managed farms and shops during the war. Introducing a German bride to family and neighbors required patience and steady confidence. But across thousands of households in post-war America, similar stories unfold, a reflection of the complicated ways war reshapes lives not only on battlefields, but far beyond them. Their marriage, once formalized, was not a grand ceremony. It was modest, sincere, and grounded in the shared understanding of everything they had endured to reach that moment. Together, they built a life shaped by resilience rather than privilege. Their story did not erase the war. It did not rewrite its causes or consequences. But it carved out a rare space where two individuals, shaped by opposite sides of the same global conflict, found a future that the war itself could not have predicted. And from that future, history gained a quieter legacy, one defined not by strategies or battles, but by the human capacity to rebuild after unimaginable loss. History often preserves the movements of armies, the signatures on treaties, and the destruction left behind by conflict. Yet the quieter stories, the ones that unfold in the margins of war, reveal something equally important about the human condition. The journey of a German woman who survived displacement, detention, and the collapse of her homeland, and the American sailor who crossed an ocean to fight a war he did not choose, is one of those stories. Their lives began on opposite sides of a global conflict. They carried different languages, different memories, and different wounds. Nothing in the structure of war suggested that their paths should ever cross. Yet war, for all its brutality, creates intersections that peace rarely does. It forces strangers to rely on one another. It exposes the fragility of borders drawn on maps, and the deeper truth that survival binds people more strongly than ideology divides them. Their connection was not built on grand gestures or romantic illusions. It emerged gradually through respect, through small acts of dignity, through the recognition of another human being trying to rebuild from nothing. It grew within the strict boundaries of military policy, shaped by paperwork, rules, and the long shadow of conflict. And when they chose to build a life together, they did so not as symbols of victory or defeat, but as individuals choosing something fragile, yet profoundly human. Hope. Many stories from the aftermath of World War II remain untold. Millions rebuilt their lives quietly, far from the headlines. But each life carried a truth that history often overlooks. War does not end on the day the guns fall silent. It ends slowly, in decisions made by ordinary people who refuse to let the past dictate the entirety of their future. Her journey from the ruins of Germany to a new life across the Atlantic, and his willingness to navigate the labyrinth of rules to bring her there, remind us that even in the wake of destruction, humanity searches for connection. And sometimes, against all expectation, it finds it. Their story stands not as a romantic legend, but as a testament that reconciliation begins with individuals, and that healing can emerge in the quiet moments after history's loudest battles have ended. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more untold human histories of World War II. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive.